Imagine this. You're a truck driver who spent the last 15 years running the same route, Windsor to Detroit, Sarnia to Port Huron, Niagara to Buffalo. Same crossings, same customs booths, same border guards who know your first name. Then, over just a few months, everything changes. Tariffs go up. Wait times spike at one bridge, drop at another. Your company suddenly tells you, "We're not using that crossing anymore. It's too risky. You're going to a port 300 kilometers away." You didn't move. The border did. Not the line on the map, but the border that matters. Where the trucks go, where the trains cross, where the money flows. Tonight on Huge Press Room, we're diving into something almost no one is talking about. How Trump's tariff war with Canada is quietly rewriting the map of the US-Canada border. Not with tanks or walls, but with spreadsheets and shipping routes. Which crossings are dying? Which ones are booming? And how this silent reshuffle could change border towns, factories, and supply chains for an entire generation. You're watching Huge Press Room. If you want more deep dives on Trump versus Canada, trade wars, and the real power games behind the headlines, hit subscribe, drop a like, and let's get into it. Most people hear tariffs and think, okay, taxes on imports, prices go up, boring economic stuff. What almost nobody sees is what happens underneath that. Trucks changing their routes. Rail companies shifting which crossings they use, ports and warehouses gaining or losing entire industries overnight. To understand the chaos, we need to start with a simple idea. The US-Canada border is not one line. It's a network. Dozens of bridges, ferries, rail tunnels, pipelines, air cargo routes. For decades, that network evolved slowly. Governments built a bridge here, expanded a port there. Private companies set up warehouses and factories where it made sense. The whole system settled into a kind of stable pattern. Then Trump picked up a hammer called 25% tariffs and smashed that pattern. Here's the basic move he made. Instead of targeting just one product, like softwood lumber, Trump used emergency powers to pile blanket tariffs on most Canadian goods. Steel, auto parts, machinery, food, a long list of industrial products suddenly had an extra 25% cost stamped on them when they crossed the border. That didn't hit every crossing equally. Some border points are heavily specialized, a bridge dominated by auto parts, a rail tunnel dominated by grain and chemicals, a port that lives on forestry exports. So when tariffs slam a specific sector, they slam whatever crossing that sector uses. If your town depends on auto parts moving between Ontario and Michigan, a tariff on auto parts is not trade policy. It's a local earthquake. Companies start asking them, can we reroute through a crossing that's less congested? Can we shift some production to a plant closer to another port? Can we use rail instead of trucks? Or vice versa, to dodge bottlenecks? And slowly, but very definitely, the border map starts to warp. Let's walk through a few ways this is already happening. First, truck traffic and road crossings. Think about the big iconic bridges, Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, Detroit, Peace Bridge near Buffalo, Blue Water Bridge at Sarnia, Port Huron. Huge amounts of manufactured goods move through these every single day. Tariffs don't just make those goods more expensive, they also inject uncertainty. Will new products be added to the tariff list next month? Will there be extra inspections linked to security or fentanyl? Will new paperwork slow down crossing times and cause delays? Companies that rely on speed, auto plants, just-in-time assembly, fresh foods, start to panic. If a crossing becomes a headache, they look for alternatives, a different bridge with slightly lighter traffic. Shipping to a US port and then using domestic trucking, building a warehouse on the other side so they can ship in bulk less often. You don't see this on CNN or in parliamentary speeches. You see it in Google Maps traffic patterns at 3 a.m., when night shift trucks stop showing up at one bridge and start lining up at another. For the border town, losing that traffic, it's brutal. Less fuel bought, less food at diners, less business for repair shops, customs brokers, tiny hotels. The line on the map hasn't moved, but the living border has shifted a few dozen kilometers away. Second, rail and ports. Tariffs push companies to ask a scary question. If getting into the US is this unpredictable, why not ship somewhere else? That's where ports come in. Canadian export flows that used to go factory, truck, US border are now being rerouted like this: factory, train, Vancouver or Prince Rupert, Asia, or factory, Port of Halifax or St. John, Europe. That doesn't mean the US loses all that trade tomorrow, but it means the default direction starts to change. Instead of thinking north-south, Canada, USA, more planners and CEOs start thinking east-west, Asia, Canada, Europe. Tariffs accelerate that mental shift. The more chaotic and political the US border feels, the more attractive it becomes to just send goods directly to non-US customers, even if the route is longer. And again, this quietly redraws the border map. Container traffic through US-Canada land crossings dips. Container traffic through Canadian seaports grows. Rail routes that used to feed American markets feed ships instead. Third, pipelines and energy routes. Energy is the most literal version of what we're talking about. For years, the border story was simple. Alberta pumps the oil, pipelines push it south, US refineries buy it at a discount. Everyone pretends this is just the way it is. Trump's tariffs and his constant threats to add more blew up that complacency. Suddenly, Canada's leaders are saying, we cannot have 95% of our oil exports going to one country whose president uses tariffs like a mood swing. Enter the push for a Pacific pipeline. If that project succeeds, a huge chunk of crude that once had to cross the US border will instead go Alberta, BC, oil tanker, Asia. That doesn't just change energy flows, it changes leverage. The US border stops being the only gateway for Canadian energy. It becomes just one of several options. And whenever you turn a choke point into a fork in the road, you redraw the map of power. Fourth, people, tourism, shoppers, and workers. It's not just goods that move differently, so do people. When Trump slaps Canada with emergency security tariffs, calls it a drug threat, and flirts with the idea of annexation, a lot of regular Canadians take it personally. You start seeing people canceling trips to Disney or New York because they don't feel welcome. Fewer Canadians crossing for shopping weekends, especially if the exchange rate is bad and tariffs are raising prices anyway. Students and workers thinking twice about applying for US visas. On the US side, border towns feel that drop like a punch. Hotels with fewer Canadian license plates. Outlet malls with empty parking spots where Ontario and Quebec cars used to be. Restaurants, nail salons, and gas stations doing quieter weekends. Meanwhile, some Canadians turn inward or sideways. Weekend trips shift from Buffalo and Bellingham to Montreal, Vancouver, or even cheap flights to Mexico and Europe. Investment that might have gone into cross-border retail parks goes into domestic or overseas options instead. Again, the official border is the same, but the emotional map, where people feel comfortable going, is being redrawn. So what does all this add up to? Let's zoom out and think in terms of winners and losers. Short-term losers, border towns whose crossings lose truck traffic and tourists. Small logistics companies built entirely around one specific bridge or tunnel. Workers in factories designed for just-in-time cross-border supply chains with zero slack. Short-term winners, ports and rail hubs that become the new escape routes for Canadian exports. Logistics players flexible enough to redesign routes quickly. U.S. towns and states that can adapt and pitch themselves as alternative gateways. But here's the bigger question. What happens if this pattern lasts 10 or 15 years? You get a structural shift. Some U.S.-Canada crossings become permanent backwaters. Others become mega corridors with bigger infrastructure and deeper political clout. Entire regions of both countries start to orient around new trade directions toward Asia, Europe, or southward to Mexico, instead of just east-west across the 49th parallel. That's what we mean by rewriting the border map. It's not about changing the treaty line. It's about changing the real-world flows the line controls. There's one more piece to this story: power. Borders are not just about where things go. They're about who has leverage. Before this trade war, the unspoken assumption was the U.S. always has leverage. Canada, as the smaller partner, has to play nice. Tariffs seem to prove that. Trump snaps his fingers and suddenly Canadian exports are paying 25% more at the border. But every time Canada responds by diversifying trade, building new routes, and reprogramming its economy away from the U.S., it is doing something that will eventually reduce that leverage. If enough trucks stop crossing at certain points, those crossings lose political importance in Washington. If enough oil and goods start going to Asia and Europe instead, U.S. refiners and buyers lose some of their bargaining power. Trump's tariffs might make him look tough in the short term. But in the long term, they push Canada to build a world where the U.S. border is less central to its survival. And once a country rewires its infrastructure, its trade deals, and its political stories around a new reality, it is very hard to rewind. Even if a future president lifts the tariffs, even if relations normalize, the new border map will remain. So I'll leave you with this. When you hear tariff war, don't just think prices go up. Think truck routes being rewritten at 3 a.m., ports rising and falling in importance, pipelines changing their direction, border towns quietly winning or losing the economic lottery, and a neighbor that used to look almost exclusively south, starting to look east and west instead. Is Trump really making America stronger by turning the U.S.-Canada border into a permanent zone of chaos? Or is he slowly training Canada and its businesses and its people to imagine a future where that border just doesn't matter as much anymore? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you want to see how this story fits into the bigger picture, check out the rest of our series here on Huge Press Room. Carney's Pipeline Revolt, how Canada is trying to escape Trump's tariff trap. The Reagan ad that made Trump terminate all trade talks. Takeo Trump, why Trump always chickens out but still wrecks the border economy. 25% tariffs. Is Trump forcing Canada to choose Asia over America? Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of Trump versus Canada. Thanks for watching Huge Press Room. I'll see you in the next one.